Okay. The reason I'm saying that, actually we told over breakfast, what's extraordinary is not just the quality of the modeling work, which I have checked into and which is impressive. It really is state of the art. It's like the Pope inaugurating a Buddhist temple. The miracle is not the temple, or actually not even the inauguration, but the origin of the message. Actually, I may not have left the central bank had I met you 20 years ago. Okay? So I'm all in favor of the Chicago plan. However, I think we can actually, in addition to the Chicago plan, do one more step that will actually reduce the risk of the proposal, which you have highlighted yourself in the transition period, and address additional issues than the monetary sustainability. That's what I'm going to be talking about. It solves 2/3 of all monetary systemic problems, and I'll tell you in a few minutes. And that by itself is, it's the biggest breakthrough in 300 years, okay, in my honest opinion. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is a monetary ecology. Now, an ecology is by definition not a monoculture, right? You have the Chicago plan plus allowing other things. We don't need to take initiatives for that. We just have to stop squashing anything that addresses the monopoly. So there's no problem with having the government issuing the currency. But why should it be the only entity doing it? Why could businesses to business not also do it, for example? So that's what I'm going to be addressing. It addresses lower risk because the Chicago plan cannot be implemented halfway, really. You cannot say, you know, okay, we'll do 50% of it. You know, it's all or nothing. Now, there is always a problem of unintended consequences in any change of any nature, okay? And doing it on a large scale, which this has to be, it's kind of on or off, has some implicit risks. And what I'm going to be proposing is something that avoids that. It includes that. It includes the possibility of implementing the Chicago plan, but goes one step further. Finally, it would address what I call non-financial or non-monetary stability issues. Things like long-term thinking, things like social breakdown, things like the financial consequences of the aging of society, things like that. Okay? So that's my plan. Now, I have focused less on the last one because I wanted to actually respond to Michael's comments. Okay? So I've been focusing on the stability of the monetary aspect, and then that's what will be my issue. There is one systemic cause for instability that has not been mentioned, and which I will highlight. And out of that comes a systemic solution. And then I conclude with returning to Chicago. All right. This is data from the IMF, from different papers. We have had 425 systemic crashes over the last 40 years. Okay? That is 10 per year. That's a monthly, a crash almost, in one country. Of course, this is averages, in the sense that some of them happen at the same time. We had 27 countries at the same time as affected in the last one. But from a perspective of a country, that's what happens. You know, Iceland is tackled, or Ireland is tackled, not just some abstract entity. So, by the way, even before 1970, if you were thinking that it's floating exchanges as the issue, Kindleberger's classic has 48 total meltdowns in 300 years. This has been as systemically problematic as modern money has existed. Okay? So that's my claim. There's a structural instability. If you had a car or a plane with this track record, would you not go back to the drawing board and not try to fiddle on the tires or, you know, okay? The theoretical basis for the affirmation I'm making, there's a systemic issue which has not been addressed, is work from complexity theory, and specifically from the conditions of stability for any complex flow network. I know that's a mouthful, okay? But I'll give you a couple of examples of complex flow networks. The starting point was Bob Ulanovich, who his name well indicates is American, right? He has spent his entire life measuring what happens quantitatively in natural ecosystems. And what we started work together 6 years ago, and the question that we raised is, what else do they have in common besides being sustainable? Because you have a huge variety of natural ecosystems, right? It can be the Amazon, and it can be a little puddle of that size in a backyard, right? It can be in all kinds of climates. There are literally thousands of very different natural ecosystems. They all have one thing in common that's obvious: to exist and therefore to be sustainable. Nobody's planted them, nobody's maintaining them, they're actually emerging spontaneously. So what else do they have in common? And here came the answer. It requires a balance between two types of activities: efficiency and resilience. Efficiency is the capacity for a system to process volume. Resilience is the capacity for a system to adapt to new circumstances, to a crisis, to an attack, to a disease or something, and change. Now, these two variables, these two emerging properties, these are emerging properties from your system, are actually functional of structural variables. That's what's very critical. Diversity and interconnectivity. More diversity gives you more resilience. Less diversity gives you more efficiency. Okay? Same thing with interconnectivity. What is interconnectivity? It is, in a natural ecosystem, who eats what. So I'll give you examples in a few minutes, in 2 slides. Let me focus on the structural nature of these things. That's where it gets very exciting. Because when you're dealing with a structural variable, it doesn't depend on what happens to flow in it. It only depends on the structure of the network. So the same conclusions apply to very different domains that have in common to be complex flow networks. Okay? And biomass in an ecosystem is one. Electrons in an electrical circuit. You know, the major blackouts that we had in America and in Germany is a consequence of too much efficiency. You know? Yes, but the breakdown of the full system was when it was pushed too far, the efficiency. There is enough resilience. There is no room for error or change or fluctuation. Information in the immune system in the medical field. And, of course, money in the economy. An economy is a complex flow network in which money circulates. Now, here's what happens in natural systems. Resilience is about 3 times more important than efficiency. What happens in a financial network? Resilience is not relevant. The only thing we take is efficiency. And as Michael mentioned earlier, for every crisis, what have we done? Put the banks bigger, because they will hopefully be more efficient. They will process more volume. Okay? So a monoculture, in no natural ecosystem on the planet is a monoculture a possibility. In none. In the tens of thousands of systems, there is not one example where that occurs. A monoculture is a recipe for an accident waiting to happen. That is the claim that I'm making. So here is a low diversity monoculture. By the way, this is the most efficient way to grow cubic feet or cubic meter of timber. It's a monoculture of pines. That's why we do that. However, a piece of glass with some sunlight, a cigarette butt, it's all gone. Resiliency, 0. You see the point? That's a very cute animal, very popular in zoos. It has one problem. It eats only one type of bamboo. Bad design, okay? In other words, it's going to go extinct. Now, what are we talking about? High diversity. And you can throw in a match there, and there may be a fire there, at least under normal circumstances. But, you know, everything will not disappear. It has more resilience. Now, this squirrel was photographed in Central Park of New York. It hasn't seen natural things to eat for 25 generations, right? I mean, including, you know, strawberries are not growing in forests, all right? So, high interconnectivity. Do we get the points here of the key variables? Now, here is a didactic explanation, because actually the object is four-dimensional. So I'm first going to explain it to you in a simpler form, and then I'll show you what it looks like in reality in 3 dimensions. The conclusions from the work, which actually is the incorporation of entropy. The driver of all this natural ecosystem is entropy, i.e. the second law of thermodynamics. For those who've done physics, you can actually question just about anything, but not entropy, because even gravity is a consequence of it. So, you know, we're talking of the most fundamental law in existence in hardcore physics. What we're doing is incorporating entropy into economics, where it has been evacuated, actually never integrated except by Nicolaas Reugen, who tried and never had a disciple. Okay? Now, the nice thing about what we found is that the form, the shape of that sustainability, we can now measure sustainability with a single variable. That's new. As soon as you talk about sustainability, typically you end up with kind of an ocean of indicators that actually try to get you somewhere, to signal you kind of things. Here, for a complex flow network, we can say, this is 67.5% sustainable. Okay? You never heard such statements. Now we can, quantitatively. Because the optimum is 1 point. Now, you can go, the optimum here is efficiency, and here is resilience, right? When you go too far in efficiency, the whole thing will collapse in one block, in one sudden shock. If you go too far in resilience, it gets stagnation. Nothing happens, just sits there. That's why you need a balance between these two. And as you see, the curve is actually closer towards resilience than to efficiency, while all our human-made systems tend to go here. Because we believe in efficiency, and we can measure it easily. So, you know, that's where we go. All natural ecosystems fall within a very narrow range of the optimum, about 2 to 3%. That's what we call the window of viability. Now, that's where the money system is. Very efficient, huge volumes, efficiency in terms of processing volume. And some of the statistics that Michael showed earlier, which is now 4 trillion per day of foreign exchange transactions, you know, it's huge. It's, you know, it dwarfs everything else. However, resilience, forget it. Now, when a collapse occurs, what happens? You go over to the other side. I'm talking of total collapses, a la Germany 1923, a la Argentina 2000, you know. So, in other words, the ruble case, I mean, where the banking system and the currency system, everything collapses. Fine. Or the 1930s, 1929. You end up on the other side, i.e., barter. Okay? Very diverse, but very, very inefficient. Everything becomes a currency, right? So what happens in a natural ecosystem when there is a collapse? Let's assume I throw an atomic bomb over a forest. You come back 30 years later, there will be something there. Something will have grown. Maybe a bit different from what it was before, but something will have happened. How will this happen? It happens like this. After the collapse, it climbs up. The more efficient ones tend to start coming back until you get back into the range, and that's where it stabilizes. What do we do in the monetary system? Every time you have a collapse, same thing, you go over to barter and survival stuff. And the next thing you do is go back to normal, back to re-establishing a monopoly of a single currency. So we're actually doing this little circle perpetually for the last 300 years. So that is how we get stuck repeatedly into the same instability. We never allow the system to choose which means of exchange to get back here. We impose a monopoly which is by nature unstable. So that's what we're doing. And I think it's time to actually do something about that structural issue. That's what I mean with the structural issue. All right, we've talked about systemic cause. I think it might be an idea to do something about it. I am recommending what I call a monetary ecosystem, which includes government-created money, but not necessarily only central government-created money. It could be cities that do, if you want to live in a particular city, they have the capacity to require from its citizens to bring, to contribute something that is being paid in a currency issued by the city. Okay? And that it requires it as a form of contribution. And if you don't do that, that's fine. Someone else do more, and I buy it off from you. It's just like we do in taxes now. And let's assume I have a painting there from Rembrandt that's worth $10 million. I owe $1,000 to the government in taxes. I cannot say, here, take the painting. It's worth, more than $1,000. They said, no, 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 no. You sell it and give me $1,000. Same thing here. If you don't have it, you buy it from someone who does, whichever way you want. We're not concerned with that. We're not asking whether, sold it to a good person or a bad person, your Rembrandt. From a city viewpoint, required. It could also be systems like business-to-business systems, but I'll get back to that later. These effects of complementary currencies, and I prefer the word complementary to alternative, which is what is announced here, because an alternative means you don't need the normal money anymore. I claim we still need the normal money, whether it is government issued or whether it's banking money issued, or both. Okay? We still need that because you're not getting diversity by getting rid of what you have. You're getting introduce diversity by actually creating something in parallel to what you have, right? Now, the argument of anybody trained in economics against multiple currencies has always been it's not as efficient. It's true. It's true. It's true. But it is more resilient, right? You cannot get resilience without some inefficiency. That's the only way to get there. That's what the science shows. So, we would then be able to introduce a system. Let's assume that you have another crisis, God forbid. Well, we can then see which ones emerge. And I'm not sure that all of them will. There will be mistakes. There will be cities managing badly their system. That can happen, just like countries do today. But the ones that are best adapted to the challenges of the 21st century will emerge and be able to go back to a viability system. Well, I've shown you an educational thing in 2 dimensions. In fact, it's a bit more complicated. Here's a 3-dimensional picture, which actually I never shown. Here is your sustainability. Now, diversity and connectivity are the two structural variables. This is what happens in a natural ecosystem. The emphasis between efficiency and resilience is shown here. That's the ratio. And what you can see is the highest level, where 100% is, actually pushes towards more diversity. The natural ecosystem will try to create additional living beings in parallel to whatever is there. It will also help some of them eat other things, a la panda starting to eat another bamboo, right? But the preferred way is this way. That's what happens in a natural ecosystem. However, if you start pushing efficiency, which is what we are doing with money, right? The capitalization, the banks are trying to push the efficiency of their capital base, okay, to create more volume, you start seeing the whole thing collapsing. And when you get to a level where you push it so seriously, there's no way that this thing will ever be sustainable. It will not collapse. Returning to Chicago. I support every one of the arguments that was made by Michael. Everything he said is, number one, extremely important, valid. The one thing that's not addressed is the issue of a monoculture, right? If the Chicago plan had been in place, we would never have had a banking crash, as he said, and we couldn't have sovereign debt crisis. And we could also add, actually, we couldn't have problems with private debt, which is an additional argument. But the sovereign debt crisis are the ones that are currently doing the newspapers. So that would not have happened. However, it only does one thing. It replaces a private monopoly with a public monopoly. It changes the manager of the system, but not the structure of the system. And that's its limitation. And one thing that would not disappear is monetary collapses, because all the governments in the world will not exactly do the same thing at the right time to avoid that there are tensions. It may be easier than today, but you still have monetary instabilities. As I already mentioned at the beginning, the Chicago plan is all or nothing, and therefore it's more risky than a monetary ecosystem. You can do it on a small scale, what I'm talking about. You start in one city. Don't do it in all cities at the same time. Start in one region. Start with one business group, not with all of them, and see what happens and what works. And decentralize the decision makings. And the government, the only thing it needs to decide really is which ones of those currencies do I decide to accept in payment of taxes, and at what conditions. And of course, it would accept its own. The Chicago plan is still in there. So what I'm recommending is basically get rid of all the stuff that tries to avoid that anybody creates a currency. You don't have to create anything new. We just have to get rid of stuff that for centuries has tried to keep a monopoly in favor of someone. Okay? There are business-to-business systems. Some of them are very old. The Weir system in Switzerland exists as a business-to-business system where a quarter of all businesses in Switzerland are member. Exists in 75 years, since 1934. It has been proven to be a significant stabilizing factor for the Swiss economy. It's one of those mysteries, Switzerland, right? Why is it that when you take a bunch of Frenchmen, put a bunch of Germans, and then a sprinkling of Italians on top of it, and you put them in a border, and the whole thing is more stable than any one of the other three countries? I mean, it's like a recipe for a cake or something, right? What is the secret? The secret is that stupid little currency that nobody ever talks about. Okay? Which actually is counter-cyclical, spontaneously, without having a central bank needed, because there's people doing it the bottom up. Environmental currencies. A currency that would make it profitable to think long term. Would that not be nice? Actually, I believe ExxonMobil knows more about energy than anybody else. But when they optimize what they know on the basis of the next 2 or 3 quarters, I am in trouble. If they were doing it for 100 years, actually I think it would be a lot better done than anybody else could do. There is a currency that can do that, that would work in parallel with the others, not excluding them. It's commodity-backed, I should not get into the details. Social purpose currencies. I designed and implemented in the city of Ghent in Belgium a system, a currency issued by a city, for the poorest neighborhood of all of Flanders. Majority Turkish, 23 languages spoken, mostly new immigrants. It's a currency that I made an inquiry among the community. What do they really want? The answer was, we dream of a little garden. Not big, 4 square meters, which you can grow some vegetables and some things, because that's what I did when I was in Anatolia. Everybody had land, okay? So the city gave them access to a site that actually an old factory that was raised, and they built themselves the land, and this stuff, these plots of land are available for 4 square meters, only for rent, but not for rent in euros, in Turkus. The Turkish currency issued by the city. And here's the list of activities in which you can earn the Turkus. Cleaning up your neighborhood, putting a box of flowers on the street side of your building. Stuff like that, that the city likes to do. They never had, in the history of Ghent, more volunteers. At cost to the city, 0, the printing of the Turkus. Okay? So, thank you very much.